In 220, Origen introduced infant baptism. Constantine, for his own purposes, adopted Christianity when he took over. The Edict of Toleration endorsed religion as being legal. House churches in 380 were outlawed, and that continues to be the pattern even in the Protestant Reformation. Luther and Calvin tried to wipe out the house churches. There was loss of control in their mind. 431, the Council of Ephesus. Mary was then instituted Mary worship as the Mother of God and all that. And as the state churches see all this starts getting enforced, Leo the Great, of course, became the so-called Bishop of Rome. Valentian confirmed as a spiritual leader of the Western Empire. This is just a recount of what we talked about last time. And then they started adopting a common priestly code about 500. Justinian, the state ordained church, the state not only permits it, it now ordains it. And you have the first pope title goes to several different claimants. Kissing the Pope's foot begins in 709. Worship of images and relics develops in the 8th century. Use of holy water begins in 850. The canonization of dead saints in 995, just before the millennium ends. Fasting on Fridays before Lent was introduced just at 998. Celibacy of the priesthood was instituted in 1070. The hidden agenda there is to keep priests from having an estate, to have all property belong to the church. So if they're celibate, they don't have an estate. They may have illegitimate sons. That doesn't encumber the assets. Prayer beads adopted from paganism in 1090. The Inquisition begins against the Jews and witches and what have you in 1184 and on. 1254, they officially established the sale of indulgences and so on. That's 3 centuries before Luther, by the way. 1215, transubstantiation of water and wine. 1229, the reading of the Bible forbidden to laymen in 1229 and on. 1414, the communion cup forbidden to lay people. 1439, the doctrine of purgatory was decreed. That's not biblical, obviously. 1492, the Jews were outlawed in Spain in 1492. That's why Columbus had to split before midnight with his crew. 1545, the tradition granted equal authority with the Bible. That's where it starts to get shredded. Even in Judaism today, the whole Kabbalah really repudiates and goes contrary to the Torah upon theoretically it's based, because they start mixing it with traditions, and as we say in the computer business, you torture the data long enough, it'll confess to anything. And of course, that brings you to 1517, Luther's 95 Theses. Actually, the winds of Reformation started a couple centuries earlier, but it was one of these crystallizing events, which led to Zwingli and Melanchthon and Calvin, John Knox, and others. We have the reversions then to traditional forms of worship get persecuted. The Anabaptists get slaughtered and so forth. Even Luther has statements like, all lay pastors teaching publicly are to be killed. These are pronouncements of Luther and Calvin and the like. They had their own power problems. And Springfield was outlawed, disciples jailed, and so forth. In 1600, we had 40 translations from the Latin Bible. That's putting the Bible into people's hands so they can go to the real authority. 1,700 of the Huguenots murdered. One of the leaders executed before 10,000 witnesses. So 4th century, we had it canonized by the state. Independent fellowships are, outlawed and persecuted. Then we have the Reformation. They did a marvelous job on soteriology, the doctrine of salvation. But the other traditions are ignored, namely eschatology and so on. And even the Protestant leadership continues to persecute deviant groups adhering to biblical doctrines. And that's a shock to many. And I know it was to Dave Hunt when he researched his book, What Love Is This? And how Calvinism misrepresents the character of God. It's a very controversial book that I encourage you to take a look at and evaluate yourself. Well, we go through more of these. There's a whole bunch of these deviant groups. We won't go through all of that. The Weslie Revival is interesting to notice. Everybody knows about the Weslie Revival. Many people don't realize what it constituted. They involved directed growth and discipleship, not just coming down the sawdust trail. Their groups were called bands. You started with a trial band, which emphasized prevenient grace, that is, grace that precedes your commitment. And this was for provisional seekers, if you will. 4 to 6 people went weekly with a leader for a couple of months. And when you outgrew that, you were allowed to go to what's called a class meeting, which was convincing grace, that dealt with the mind. You were a member of the society then, 12 to 36 people. You'd attend that for about 2 years before you went to a band meeting, converting grace. And in that kind of groups, you divide into 4 to 8 people, all born again by now. And then a select band where it's spirit-filled. So the point is they had these different groups, but they had it highly organized. How you earned your way from one to the next, if you will. In 1768, after 30 years, they had 40 so-called circuits, 27,000 members. By 1800, 1 of 30 Englishmen were a member of the Weslie Revival. But again, it was the dynamics of a small group. Now, I'm not saying this is the right way to do it. That's the way they did it. When they died, it all fell apart. We have alternatives today. The megachurch is a popular one. Many people are familiar with that. There's also a place for the local congregational church in the more typical model. And then we also have small study groups. Some of these are cells at homes that are organized or supervised by the local church. Very healthy, very appropriate way to do things. Some of the home fellowships are independent because they're not encouraged, or in some cases discouraged by the local churches. And then we have actually not only home fellowship, but home churches. There's a slight difference there. The whole congregational church idea, you have a building, first of all, that we call a cathedral or a church. You have a special day, typically it's Sunday, not Shabbat. It's a professional leadership, a priest, clergyman, or a hireling that leads it all. And then you have a special service performed for the people with ceremonies, interpretations, and motivational speeches. And it has a way to maintain itself with tithes and offerings. That's the basic model of the typical, nominal, stereotype congregational church. There is a life cycle for such churches. That may surprise you. Everything has a life cycle. Nations have life cycles as well as people. You start with a people-oriented pastor. He draws a crowd. He pretty soon becomes pulpit-oriented. Man, we got a pretty good crowd. Then as that grows, he becomes property-oriented. Hey, we need a bigger cathedral. And that, remember Gideon. You know, Gideon had this incredible victory. They wanted to make him king. He says, I won't take your king, I'll take your money, though. And he went instead build his estate. So when he died, his 70 sons get murdered by his bastard son. There is a danger in accumulating too many assets, as some churches are finding out today. And that leads, of course, to a power-oriented pastorate. We have the return of the Nicolaitans, if you will. And that leads to politically driven decay. That tragically is a cycle that one can visualize in some places. And the issue, of course, is accountability and management by hearsay and all these other evils that they argue that Matthew 18 wasn't for us, that was for the layman. Politics always emerge when there's no objective function. If you're an infantry squad, or if you're at a sales organization where you have numbers every week, what you've done, or if there's an objective function for the organization, then it tends to be performance-oriented. But where that's lacking, as is the case in schools, hospitals, and churches, how do you measure whether it's a good or bad job? It's a qualitative judgment. And that's when politics takes reign. Let's take an example of one modern example. It's not the one to follow necessarily. It's just an interesting one to study, called the Rock Church in San Diego. Everyone in Sunday church has to be in a small group of 6 to 12. Once it's more than 12, they force them to split. These small groups meet weekly under a facilitator. He's not a teacher. He just directs the discussion. They meet together, pray together, discuss the notes that were emailed to them from the Sunday sermon. They hold themselves accountable, and when they pray for their friends' children, they know their names. And when it goes beyond 12, it is forced to split in two. In 2 years, this church has grown to over 4,000. I think it's about 8,000 now. This was written some months ago. So that's one example. What's interesting is I think that the average age is under 25 in the church, the young people. They're excited about it. If there's a meeting and they're 5 minutes late, they're out. They're serious. They take themselves seriously. And the kids love that. They eat it up. It's astonishing. See, these small groups have some advantages that the structural denominational churches don't have. They have a disciplined multiplication. It's called mitosis. Cells divide. Soon you have twice as many, then you have 4 times as many. There's an intrinsic multiplication that takes place. They're free of growth barriers. There isn't a leadership problem. All you need is facilitators. Because there's plenty of materials around if someone just lead the discussion about them. The participants are involved. In fact, the facilitator's primary job is to make sure everybody participates in the discussion. There's personal transformation evident, and thus accountability among the group. This is more effective for new Christians because they're in an environment where they can ask dumb questions. And it also solves the leadership crisis. It's more biblical than any of the models that we generally see on the horizon. It's also persecution-proof structure. If everybody's meeting in small homes across the landscape, how are you going to get your hands on that one? A lot tougher. A lot tougher. It's also more efficient. There's no cost. Fundamentally. Interesting. The true church is a supernatural invention